I woke up in the hospital with stitches on my stomach and a divorce notice on my bedside table. My husband had ended our marriage while I was still unconscious. He'd even sold our house, the place we built together. Everyone told me to forget him and move on, but they didn't know what that house really was. It wasn't just a home. It held something that could destroy him if it ever came out. And that's when I decided I wasn't leaving quietly. When I stared at that piece of paper, I couldn't feel anything at first. It was like my mind went blank, as if my body knew pain before my heart did. The words divorce granted and property sold didn't even look real. I thought maybe I was dreaming from the medication. Then I looked at the hospital clock, ticking slow and steady, and realized this wasn't a nightmare. My husband, the man I trusted most, had left me behind while I was fighting for my life. I remembered our last conversation before the surgery. He stood by my bedside, pretending to worry. I told him to go home and rest, but he insisted he'd stay nearby. I believed him. He even kissed my hand before the nurses wheeled me away. But now I understood that kiss meant goodbye. While I was unconscious, he was signing papers, making sure my name was erased from the home we built together. The betrayal didn't sting right away. It settled in quietly, like a slow poison spreading through me. The nurses said he never visited once. Not a single call or message came during my recovery. When I asked if anyone left flowers, the nurse looked down, pretending to check her clipboard. That silence told me everything. Whatever love we had was long gone, replaced by something cold and calculated. I couldn't wrap my head around how someone could be so cruel, especially when I was at my weakest. I began to wonder if he'd been planning this long before the hospital. One nurse, an older woman with kind eyes, whispered something when she thought no one was listening. She said a younger woman came by a few days earlier, asking about me. She had been with my husband. My chest tightened, and I thanked her quietly. That was all the proof I needed. He wasn't just moving on, he had already replaced me. And maybe that woman had something to do with the sudden sale of our house. I promised myself I'd find out who she was and why she mattered. I called my best friend Sarah from the hospital phone. She sounded shocked, but not surprised. She told me the house had already been sold. The buyers moved in 2 days after my surgery. The speed of it didn't make sense. Sales like that don't happen overnight. It had to be arranged long before. Sarah offered to pick me up when I was discharged, but I told her I needed time. I wasn't ready to face anyone. I just needed to think and plan what to do next. When I got off the call, I stared out the window. The hospital overlooked a busy street, full of people walking, laughing, living their normal lives. I wondered how many of them were pretending to be okay. The thought calmed me in a strange way. I wasn't alone in being hurt, but I refused to stay broken. The house meant more than walls and paint. It held memories and one secret that could change everything. I started to remember that night we buried something behind it. That secret came back like a spark flickering in my memory. The night had been cold, and he made me swear never to tell anyone what we buried. I thought it was silly at the time, a strange promise between us, but now I realized it was serious. It was something he didn't want the world to find out. My body still ached from the surgery, but I could feel anger replacing the pain. If he thought I'd stay quiet after what he did, he was wrong. I felt like two people trapped in one body. One part of me wanted peace and healing. The other part craved control, to take back what he stole. That contradiction pulled at me every second. I didn't want revenge for the sake of revenge. I wanted truth. I needed to know why he did this, and what he was hiding. The calm side of me said to let the lawyers handle it, but the part of me that refused to be a victim said otherwise. When I reached for my hospital bag, I noticed something missing. My wedding ring, which I had taken off before surgery, was gone. I remembered giving it to him for safekeeping. Now it wasn't there. That small piece of gold felt like the last proof of what we used to be, and now it was gone too. It wasn't just a ring anymore. It was proof of how easily he could erase me. That small discovery made my decision clearer than ever. I had to find out everything. Later that day, a lawyer called. He spoke in a calm, rehearsed tone. He told me it was best not to cause trouble and just move forward. He said my husband wanted everything handled peacefully. His words sounded polite, but they carried a warning. I thanked him and hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the floor tiles, realizing I was officially on my own. No one was going to fix this for me. I'd have to handle it myself. I signed my discharge papers earlier than I should have. My body wasn't ready, but I couldn't stay in that hospital another night. The air there felt heavy, filled with reminders of weakness. I needed to move, to act. The nurse offered a wheelchair, but I refused. Every step hurt, but each one made me feel like I was taking my life back. I caught my reflection in the hospital glass doors, pale, tired, but still standing. That was enough for now. As the taxi drove me through familiar streets, everything looked smaller. The coffee shop where we used to go on weekends, the park where we planned our future, they all looked distant now. When the car passed our old neighborhood, my chest tightened. I asked the driver to slow down. My old house stood there, perfectly painted, as if nothing had changed. But I knew better. Something inside that house had shifted forever, and I was no longer part of it. Through the window, I saw people unloading boxes from a moving truck. A family was moving in, laughing, carrying furniture, making plans. It was surreal to see strangers touching my life. The curtains I picked out, the porch I painted, the place where I planted roses, all now belonged to them. I wanted to scream, but instead, I just watched quietly. The world doesn't stop for broken hearts. It keeps moving like nothing happened, but something did happen, and I wasn't ready to let it go yet. I parked nearby and sat in my car, staring at the house. I could see into the living room through the open curtains. The walls were freshly painted, the furniture new. Everything that once felt like home now looked foreign. Then I heard something faint, a doorbell ringing from inside the house, even though no one was near the door. It made me freeze for a second. That sound brought back memories of what we hid there. The secret wasn't gone. It was still waiting. The doorbell sound faded, but the thought didn't. I knew exactly what that sound meant. It was near the spot where we buried the box. I couldn't explain it, but something told me he had gone back for it. The house held more than love or lies. It held evidence. I looked down at the jar of imported honey still sitting in my bag. The last thing he ever gave me. I held it tight and made myself a promise. I was going to uncover everything he buried. As I sat in the car, the faint sound of the doorbell still echoed in my head. I couldn't shake it. It wasn't just nostalgia or nerves, it felt like a reminder that house wasn't done with me yet. The memory of what we buried flashed again, clearer this time. It wasn't jewelry or papers. It was a voice recorder sealed in a tin box. He said it was for emergencies. Now I finally understood that recorder had his confession. And if he went to such lengths to erase me, that recording must have been the reason. I reached into my bag and touched the jar of honey again. It was sticky on the lid, faintly smelling of the past. It had always been his way of calming arguments, showing up with small sweetness instead of real apologies. Now it felt like poison disguised as kindness. I placed it on the passenger seat and started the car. I didn't have a plan yet, just a direction. I needed to remember exactly where that recorder was buried. My mind kept circling that one night like it was begging me to go back. I could see it clearly now. The night we buried the recorder, he had been anxious pacing the yard under the dim porch light. He made me swear never to tell anyone what was inside. I thought it was something work-related, some confidential business deal. But now, I knew it was more. He was hiding something illegal, something dangerous. I wanted to call the police that very moment, but I didn't have proof yet. I had to find that recorder first. My entire body trembled with both fear and determination. I went to stay with my sister that night. She was shocked to see me standing at her door, with a hospital band still on my wrist. She hugged me tight, but when I told her what happened, she went quiet. She said maybe I should just let it go, that I'd already suffered enough. She was trying to protect me, but I couldn't. Something deep inside told me this wasn't over. I wasn't chasing a lost marriage anymore. I was chasing the truth buried under that house. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how fast everything had fallen apart. In just a few weeks, I'd gone from being a wife with a home to someone without either. But that recorder, That secret gave me purpose. Around midnight, I opened my laptop and started searching property records. I found the sale details easily. The buyer's name seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it yet. My hands felt cold as I copied it down. I knew I had seen that name somewhere before, maybe on his work documents. The next morning, I went for a walk to clear my head. The streets were quiet, and the air smelled of rain. My sister's neighborhood was calm, almost too calm. I stopped by a small cafe, ordered a coffee, and opened my laptop again. I searched the buyer's name online. Within minutes, it showed up linked to his company. My heart sank. He hadn't sold the house to a stranger. He'd sold it to one of his business partners. The sale was fake, a transfer to hide something. He wasn't just greedy, he was scared. Realizing that made everything click into place. He didn't just want me gone emotionally. He needed me out of the way legally. If the secret in that house came out, it could destroy more than just his marriage. It could ruin his entire career. That's why the divorce happened while I was still unconscious. It wasn't personal anymore. It was strategic. I closed the laptop and sat there for a while, staring at nothing. Every piece of trust I'd ever had in him had turned to ash. I decided to go see the house up close. I couldn't just rely on memories or documents. I needed to feel it, to sense what had changed. I told my sister I was visiting a friend and drove across town. The new family's cars were parked outside, and children's toys were scattered across the lawn. It almost made me feel guilty for what I was planning, but then I remembered what he did to me. Guilt didn't belong here. Justice did. I just had to find a way in without causing a scene. I parked a few houses down and waited. Hours passed as I sat there watching the windows. A woman came out briefly to water plants, then went back inside. I didn't recognize her, but when a black SUV pulled up later, my heart stopped. The driver got out. It was her. The same woman the nurse had mentioned, the one from the hospital. She was with him the entire time. Now she was the buyer. I knew right then that the sale wasn't real. It was a cover for something much bigger. The sun began to set, and I stayed put. The house lights came on one by one, glowing warm in the dark. It looked peaceful, but I could feel the truth underneath. I waited until all lights went off, except one upstairs window. That used to be my room. I could see the outline of someone moving inside. Probably her. The thought made me clench my hands. I whispered to myself that I wasn't there for revenge. I was there for evidence. The difference mattered, at least for now. When the street went quiet, I stepped out of the car and walked toward the backyard. Every step made my heart thump heavier in my chest. The grass was different now, shorter, trimmed, too neat, but I could still see the faint outline of the spot near the rosebush where we buried it. I knelt down and touched the dirt. It felt softer, disturbed. That meant someone had already been here. I started digging with my hands, not caring about the mess or pain in my stitches. I just needed to know. My fingers hit something hard, and for a second, hope shot through me. But when I pulled it up, it wasn't the recorder. It was a piece of an old broken tile. The box was gone. He had come back for it. I sat there in the dark yard, breathing unevenly, the world spinning around me. I felt like he had won again, taking even the one thing that could expose him. But then I remembered, if he took it, he had to store it somewhere safe. I just had to find out where. I brushed the dirt off my hands and looked under the porch, where we used to keep spare keys. The space was small, full of spiderwebs and dust. My hand touched something folded. It was a piece of paper, an old receipt. When I opened it under the porch light, my stomach turned. It was for a storage unit under his name, dated just a week ago. My pulse picked up. That had to be where the box was now. I folded the paper carefully and knew my next step was clear. The next morning, I drove to the storage address written on the receipt. The building was on the edge of the industrial district, gray and forgotten. A man sat behind a glass window at the front desk, flipping through a magazine. I told him I needed to access a unit under my husband's name. He looked at me suspiciously and asked for ID. I smiled weakly and showed an old envelope with both our names on it. He sighed, said something about divorces being messy, and handed me a key. The hallway inside smelled like metal and old dust. My footsteps echoed on the concrete floor as I walked past numbered doors. When I reached his unit, I paused for a moment, unsure if I was ready for what might be inside. But then I thought about the hospital, the ring, and the empty house. I unlocked the door. The air inside was cool and dry, filled with boxes and furniture. Everything he didn't want others to see was hidden here, and I was about to uncover it. Before I stepped further inside, I pulled out my phone and recorded a video. I wanted proof of whatever I found. The storage space was filled with our old furniture, photos, and boxes labeled with dates I didn't recognize. It felt like walking through a museum of lies. Near the back was something large, covered with a sheet. I pulled it off and gasped. It was my old piano, the one I begged him to keep when we moved, but he said was too damaged. He'd kept it here, perfectly intact. I opened the piano lid, out of instinct, not knowing why. Inside, taped to the inner wood, was a small velvet pouch. My fingers shook as I pulled it free. When I opened it, I found a broken locket with ashes inside. My chest tightened. I remembered his mother's funeral and how strange he'd acted after. He always said her ashes were symbolic, that he never wanted to keep them, but here they were, hidden away with everything else he didn't want. My gut told me this was connected. I placed the locket on top of the piano and looked around the unit again. I noticed a small locked drawer built into one of the old cabinets. The lock looked weak. I used a screwdriver from a nearby box to pry it open. Inside there was a small USB stick taped to the back panel. My breath caught. I didn't know what was on it, but I knew it mattered. I tucked it in my pocket, grabbed the receipt as evidence, and left before anyone could see me. I stopped at a cafe a few blocks away. The place was quiet, just a few people typing on laptops. I sat near the corner table and plugged the USB into my computer. A folder popped up with several audio files named by dates and numbers. I clicked one, and his voice filled my ears. He was talking to his business partners, discussing fake accounts and money transfers. My heart pounded harder with every word. He had used my name as a co-signer on fraudulent contracts. That's why he needed me gone. I sat frozen, listening to recording after recording. Each one was worse than the last. He wasn't just hiding money, he was covering crimes that could ruin him forever. My name was on documents that tied me directly to his fraud. That was the real reason behind the sudden divorce. He had to separate himself from me before the truth came out, leaving me to take the fall. I closed the laptop and stared out the window. I wasn't just betrayed, I had been framed. That realization filled me with a cold kind of calm. For the first time, I knew exactly what I had to do. I started making copies of the files on cloud storage. I wrote down the phone numbers mentioned in the recordings. My hands moved fast, driven by clarity. I wasn't scared anymore. I was prepared. Before I left the cafe, I glanced at the honey jar sitting in my bag. It looked harmless, but it had become my reminder. Sweetness always hides rot underneath. I would never fall for it again. Back in the car, I sent anonymous emails to his business partners with some of the recordings attached. I didn't add a message. I wanted the evidence to speak for itself. I didn't care if they figured out who sent it. I just wanted the truth out in the open. When I hit send, it felt like a small spark of justice ignited. I sat there for a minute, breathing deeply, watching the city lights blur through the windshield. For the first time in months, I felt in control. That night, as I reached my sister's place, my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered, thinking it might be one of the partners. A male voice, low and calm, told me to stop what I was doing if I wanted to stay safe. My stomach turned. I hung up immediately and blocked the number, but the warning stuck with me. Fear crept in, but it didn't paralyze me. It pushed me harder. If he had people watching, it meant I was getting close to something they wanted hidden. The next morning, I met a private investigator recommended by a friend. His office was small and cluttered, walls covered in old case files. I told him everything, from the hospital to the storage unit. He listened carefully, not interrupting once. When I finished, he leaned back and said I was walking a dangerous line. He warned that people with money and power don't like loose ends. I told him I didn't care. I just wanted truth, not revenge. After a long pause, he agreed to help me. We started working together that week. He dug into my husband's company, tracing transactions, names, and shell accounts. I supplied whatever I could remember. Every night, we pieced the puzzle together like detectives in silence. And with every detail we uncovered, I saw how deep my husband's lies ran. It wasn't just business fraud. It was a web of deceit that touched everything, even my marriage. The investigator said we were close to something big. I didn't know what that meant yet, but for once, I was ready to find out. The investigator and I met almost every day that week. He worked quietly but efficiently, printing documents and highlighting names. Each folder he opened seemed to reveal another layer of deceit. He discovered that my husband had created multiple offshore accounts. Money flowed in and out, disguised under fake invoices. My name appeared on several of them as a silent partner. It made me sick to think that while I was healing from surgery, he was using my identity to protect himself. Every document felt like another knife to the back. I tried not to think about what would happen if the authorities saw my name on those records. Without proof of what he did, I'd be the one in trouble. The investigator reassured me that once everything was documented, it would clear me completely. His calm confidence helped me breathe easier. Together, we drafted a plan to leak the information to the right sources. But before that, he said we needed undeniable evidence, something linking my husband's voice, his signature, and his intent. That meant finding the missing recorder or another audio proof. We spent the next few days looking for leads on the recorder's location. I revisited the storage unit, hoping I missed something. I checked every box, every drawer, even behind shelves. Nothing. The investigator searched online for any purchases or rentals tied to him in the past few weeks. That's when we found a new listing, a second storage unit under a fake name. It was in a different part of town, smaller, and rented the same week I left the hospital. My heart raced. This had to be where he hid the box. When we reached the new storage facility, the front desk clerk said the renter had visited just the night before. That confirmed it. He was still keeping an eye on things. We waited until the clerk stepped away, and the investigator quietly picked the lock. Inside the small unit, the air was stale and musty. Only 2 boxes sat in the corner. One was labeled tools, the other misc. I opened the second box carefully. Right at the bottom, beneath old files and a cracked photo frame, was a small tin container. I lifted the tin box, brushing away the dust. It was the same one we buried years ago. The metal was slightly rusted, but the latch still worked. The investigator nodded, and I opened it slowly. Inside, wrapped in a piece of old cloth, was the voice recorder. It looked exactly as I remembered it. For a moment, I just stared at it, my mind filling with memories of that night in the backyard. He had trusted me to bury his secret, thinking I'd never have the strength to dig it up. He was wrong. We played the recorder back at the investigator's office. The voice that came through was calm but confident. It was my husband. He spoke about moving money between accounts, creating false invoices, and paying off auditors. He mentioned names, dates, even specific amounts. But one part froze us both. He said he planned to take care of the only person who could link him to the fraud. That person was me. I sat there staring at the recorder, realizing that the surgery might not have been the only thing that almost killed me. The investigator leaned forward and said softly that this was enough to destroy his entire operation. We made digital copies of the recording and sent them to multiple secure drives. My stomach churned, not from fear but from the weight of what I held. I had proof, not only of his crimes but of his intent to silence me. That night, as I left the office, I looked up at the city skyline. The lights blurred through my tired eyes. For the first time, I felt like the truth was finally within reach. Back at my sister's house, I tried to rest, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying his voice from that recording. Every word echoed through me. I thought about how easily he could lie, how calmly he could plan to erase me. I realized I had been living beside a stranger for years. Our marriage had been built on something hollow, something rotten underneath the surface. I looked at my reflection in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. I wasn't weak anymore. I wasn't broken. I was ready to fight back. The next morning, the investigator called with news. He said one of my husband's business partners had gone quiet after receiving the anonymous files I'd sent earlier. Another one had started moving money around in panic. It meant the leaks were working. I smiled faintly for the first time in weeks. My husband had spent his life controlling everyone. But now the walls were closing in on him. The investigator said it was only a matter of time before someone turned against him. That time, I said, couldn't come soon enough. Later that day, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, it was him. His voice was calm but strained. He said he wanted to talk, to clear things up. I didn't respond at first. He told me he knew I'd been digging around. He warned that I was putting myself in danger. I told him I'd heard that line before, and hung up. I stared at my phone afterward, realizing how scared he must be. He finally understood that I wasn't the helpless woman he left behind. After that call, strange things started happening. My emails were being accessed from unknown devices. I started noticing a car parked near my sister's house every night, the same one each time. When I mentioned it to the investigator, he told me to keep my location private. We started meeting in public places instead of his office. He even gave me a burner phone for safety. I didn't like living in fear, but I reminded myself, this wasn't about fear anymore. It was about finishing what he started and turning it against him. The investigator managed to reach a contact at the Financial Crimes Division. They agreed to review the material anonymously, but only if we could verify every detail. We spent hours matching voices to documents, signatures to recordings. My husband's arrogance was our advantage. He had left his mark on everything, thinking no one would ever question him. When we finally uploaded the files to the secure portal, I felt something lift off my chest. It wasn't over yet, but the first real step toward justice had been taken. That night I sat alone in my sister's kitchen. The house was quiet, except for the sound of rain tapping on the windows. I made a cup of tea and stared at the honey jar, still sitting on the table. It was nearly empty now, sticky around the edges. I thought about throwing it away, but decided to keep it. It reminded me of everything fake he'd ever done, the way he coated lies with sweetness. I wiped the lid clean and placed it in a drawer. It would stay there, just like the past. A few days later, my sister told me someone had called the house asking for me. The caller refused to leave a name. She looked worried, but I told her not to panic. I knew exactly who it was. He was getting desperate. The investigator said, we should expect some kind of reaction now that the evidence was circulating. I started keeping my phone off more often, avoiding social media. I didn't want him to know what I was planning next. Silence was my new weapon, and I used it carefully. We decided to move forward with one final step, exposing his network publicly. The investigator had arranged for a journalist he trusted to review the story. I met the journalist at a small diner outside the city. He was sharp, direct, and didn't waste time. I handed over a folder of files, printouts, and a copy of the recording. He promised to verify everything before publishing. As I watched him leave, I realized that once this went live, there would be no turning back. My husband's empire of lies would finally collapse. The next morning, the investigator texted me. They're on to him. I turned on the news and saw it myself. Reports about corporate fraud and misuse of identity filled the screen. They didn't mention names yet, but I recognized the signs. He was being investigated. My heart pounded with a strange mix of relief and fear. I knew he'd retaliate somehow. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and kept the lights on. I wasn't going to run. I wanted him to see that I wasn't hiding anymore. I was waiting. That night, I couldn't sleep. The rain outside had turned heavy, and thunder rolled in the distance. My sister had already gone to bed, but I sat by the window with my tea. I thought about how much my life had changed. I was no longer his victim. I had found strength in the very pain he caused. The investigator had called me brave earlier, but it didn't feel like bravery. It felt like survival. I was just doing what I had to do to finally breathe again. Before we continue, if you're still watching and want to know how this story ends, take a second to subscribe and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. It truly helps me keep sharing stories like this one that show how strength can rise from betrayal. Now let's see what happened next. 2 days later, the investigator told me something unexpected. One of my husband's partners wanted to meet me privately. He claimed he had information that could speed up the investigation. I hesitated, but agreed. As long as the investigator came along, we met the man in a quiet restaurant. He looked nervous, his hands shaking as he handed over a folder. Inside were bank statements and photos of my husband meeting with officials overseas. The man said my husband was trying to move the last of his stolen money. The investigator thanked him, and we left quickly. Back in the car, I opened the folder again. One of the photos showed my husband with a woman. It was her, the same woman from the hospital and the house. She wasn't just his new partner in life. She was his accomplice in crime. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. I realized they both thought I was weak enough to forget, but now I was the one holding every card that could end them. The next morning, the investigator helped me prepare a final report to send directly to the authorities. Every piece of data, every document, every photo was neatly organized. I wanted there to be no room for denial. I included a note stating I was the original victim and the evidence source. When it was ready, we hit send together. I didn't know what would happen next, but it didn't matter. I had already taken back control of my life, and that alone felt like justice. Later that evening, I received another message from an unknown number. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was my husband. He wrote only a few words. "We need to talk. Please." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. I said one sentence: "Meet me tomorrow at the cafe where we first met." If he wanted to talk, it would be on my terms. I wanted to see his face when he realized everything had turned against him. The cafe hadn't changed much since the last time we were there together. The same wooden chairs, the same smell of roasted beans. I sat by the window, waiting. When he walked in, he looked thinner, paler, and worn out. He sat across from me, trying to smile, but his eyes were full of panic. He started talking fast, saying the investigation was getting out of hand, that we could fix things if I stayed quiet. I let him talk until his words became meaningless noise. I just listened calmly, letting silence do the work. After a few minutes, he leaned closer and whispered that I had no idea what I'd started. He said people were going to get hurt, that I was in danger. I took out my phone and played a small clip from the voice recorder, the part where he said he'd take care of me. His face drained of color. He realized I wasn't bluffing. I looked him in the eye and told him quietly that I already sent everything. He didn't say another word. He stood up and left, shaking. When he walked out of that cafe, I felt a strange peace wash over me. The kind of peace that comes when you've finally stopped running. I sat there a while longer, finishing my coffee. The world outside looked the same, but everything inside me had changed. The control he once had over my life was gone for good. I didn't know what would happen next with the investigation, but I knew one thing: no matter how it ended, he would never be able to bury me again. The next few days felt strangely quiet. I kept expecting chaos, but it never came. Instead, there was a stillness before whatever storm was brewing. The investigator said the authorities were reviewing the files and that we'd hear something soon. I tried to distract myself with ordinary things: laundry, reading, cooking, but every sound made me look over my shoulder. My husband had always found a way to control the situation before. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was planning something desperate to save himself from what was coming. The investigator stopped by one afternoon with a tired smile. He said he'd received confirmation from his contact that formal charges were likely to be filed soon. That meant they had verified the recordings and documents. I felt my body relax for the first time in weeks. I thanked him for everything, but he just nodded, saying this was his job. He told me to keep my phone close, though. When men like my husband start to lose power, they tend to do irrational things. I understood exactly what he meant. That night, I made myself dinner and sat by the window. The lights outside reflected against the glass like faded memories. My sister was away visiting a friend, so the house was quiet. I turned on a small lamp and opened my journal, writing down everything that had happened since the hospital. I needed to see it all in one place, to remind myself how far I had come. The lies, the betrayal, the fear. It all seemed smaller now compared to the strength I'd found within myself. Around midnight, I heard my phone buzz on the counter. It was a notification from a news app. My husband's company was under official investigation for large-scale financial fraud. His name was mentioned directly. My hands trembled as I read the article. The journalist I'd met had kept his word. It was all public now. His schemes, his accounts, everything. I couldn't believe it was finally out there. For so long he'd hidden behind charm and money. Now the truth was exposed for everyone to see. He couldn't run anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. My mind kept flashing through old memories, his laughter, our first apartment, the life we built that was now gone. I wondered if any of it had ever been real. Maybe I'd just been someone he used to make himself look whole. By morning, my exhaustion felt heavy, but so did my sense of closure. I looked out at the sunlight breaking through the clouds and whispered to myself that it was finally over. But deep down, I knew something still lingered unfinished. A few days later, the investigator called again. He said there was a new update. The authorities wanted to question me as a witness, not a suspect. Relief washed over me. He offered to go with me for support. I agreed. When we arrived at the office, the agents were professional but firm. They asked about my marriage, the documents, and the recordings. I told them everything, holding nothing back. For the first time, I didn't feel ashamed. I wasn't covering for him anymore. I was standing up for myself. When the questioning ended, one of the agents thanked me and said my cooperation had made things easier. As we left, the investigator told me the hardest part was behind me now, but he was wrong. That night, I got another message, this time from an unknown email. It had no text, only a video file. I opened it cautiously. The footage showed a car parked outside my sister's house, recorded from across the street. I recognized it immediately. It was his car. He knew where I was. My stomach sank. I showed the video to the investigator, and he advised me to stay somewhere else temporarily. I packed a small bag and went to stay at a friend's apartment on the other side of the city. It was strange starting over again, in a new space. Even for a few days, the apartment was small but quiet. I felt safer there, at least for now. I didn't tell anyone where I'd gone, except the investigator. I wanted to see if he would try to contact me again. That night, I sat on the couch, lights dimmed, listening to the rain outside. The sound reminded me of childhood, of peace, but my thoughts wouldn't settle. I kept thinking about the watch buried under the rosebush, the sound of that old doorbell, and all the little signs that had led me here. Every lie he told had built a path that guided me straight to the truth. I realized then that maybe this was my purpose, not revenge, but revelation. I wasn't here to destroy him. I was here to expose him. The next morning, I woke to several missed calls. One was from my lawyer, another from an unknown number. I ignored them both at first, making coffee instead. I turned on the news, and there it was. My husband had been taken in for questioning. Reporters surrounded the station, cameras flashing. The announcer said he was suspected of embezzlement and identity fraud. Hearing it said aloud felt surreal. I didn't smile or cry. I just sat there quietly, realizing this was the moment he could no longer twist the truth. Later that afternoon, my lawyer confirmed that the evidence had held up under review. The authorities were preparing to file charges. He also said my name had been cleared of any involvement. I thanked him, but the relief didn't feel as heavy as I thought it would. It wasn't joy or triumph. It was something gentler, like exhaling after holding your breath too long. The years of manipulation were over. For once, my life belonged to me again. I hung up the phone and just sat in stillness for a while. That night, I went for a walk. The air was cool, the streets quiet. I didn't feel afraid anymore. Every sound, the hum of streetlights, the rush of cars in the distance, felt grounding. I thought about everything I'd been through. There was a time when I wouldn't have had the courage to walk alone. But now, each step felt like reclaiming something lost. When I reached the bridge that overlooked the river, I leaned against the railing and whispered to myself that I was finally free. The words felt real this time. The next morning, the investigator called with news. He said my husband was out on bail, but his passport had been seized. He couldn't leave the country. That meant he was cornered. I felt a mix of relief and unease. Desperate men make desperate choices, and I knew he wasn't one to accept defeat easily. I asked if there was anything else I should do, and the investigator told me to stay cautious. He said if I noticed anything unusual again, I should call him immediately. I agreed, but deep down I already sensed something coming. 2 nights later, it happened. I came home late and noticed my front door slightly open. My chest tightened as I stepped inside. The lights were off, and everything looked normal at first, but something felt wrong. I checked my room, drawers open, papers scattered, laptop gone. Someone had searched the place. I called the investigator right away. He arrived quickly and examined the scene. He said whoever did it wasn't looking for valuables. They were looking for files, proof, or anything that could tie them to the crimes. I already knew who it was. We filed a police report, but I could tell the investigator was frustrated. He said my husband was becoming reckless. That kind of behavior meant he was scared. I sat on the couch as he spoke, thinking about how much fear used to control me. Now it was controlling him instead. The balance had shifted. I wasn't powerless anymore. The investigator promised to increase surveillance and help me recover the stolen items. But deep down, I wasn't worried about the laptop. Everything important was already backed up and secure. The next morning, I received an email from a news outlet asking for an interview. They wanted to hear my story. The woman who had helped expose a multi-million-dollar fraud. I didn't know what to say at first. I wasn't ready to share it publicly yet, but part of me wanted people to understand that silence can be dangerous, that pretending everything is fine can destroy lives. I wrote back, saying maybe one day, but not now. This wasn't about fame or pity, it was about reclaiming peace. Later that day, I visited the investigator's office. He handed me a small flash drive and said it contained the full evidence package for my records. I took it, holding it like something sacred. He smiled and told me I'd done more than most people ever could. I told him I hadn't done it alone. He looked at me for a moment and said quietly, "You just needed someone to remind you what you already had inside." That stayed with me. For the first time, I believed it was true. That evening, I stopped by a small park on my way home. The air smelled of wet grass and earth. I sat on a bench watching families play and couples walk by. For the first time in months, I felt calm. Not the forced calm I used to fake, but real peace. I thought about how far I'd come from the hospital bed, the betrayal and the lies. I had walked through every kind of pain he'd caused and come out standing. The thought made me smile softly without realizing it. When I returned home, I noticed a plain envelope on the doorstep. There was no name, just my address written neatly. Inside was a printed photo of me sitting in the cafe where I had met him weeks ago. My heart dropped. It was recent. Someone had been following me. The investigator said later, it was likely his people trying to intimidate me. I didn't feel fear anymore though. I just felt tired. I placed the photo in a drawer and locked it away. They couldn't scare me back into silence again. That night, I dreamed of the house, the roses, the porch, the faint sound of the doorbell ringing. In the dream, I walked through the halls, and everything was clean and quiet. The jar of honey sat on the table, but this time, it was empty. I picked it up and set it outside on the porch. When I woke up, I realized what it meant. The sweetness that once blinded me was gone for good. There was nothing left of him in me anymore. Only clarity, only freedom. The next morning, the investigator called with one final update. He said the case was officially moving to trial. My husband's assets were frozen, his accounts under government control. The woman he'd been with was also charged for her involvement. Hearing that felt like the last puzzle piece clicking into place. The story was coming full circle. I thanked him and told him I wanted to attend the trial, not to gloat, but to watch justice happen with my own eyes. He said he'd make sure I was safe when I did. The day of the trial hearing, I sat in the back row of the courtroom. My husband entered in a gray suit, but he looked smaller somehow, his confidence gone. He avoided my gaze completely. When the charges were read aloud, I watched his shoulders tense. The prosecutor listed every fraudulent act, every account, every lie. It was like watching the mask I once loved crumble in real time. I didn't feel anger anymore, just a quiet acceptance that this was how things were always meant to end. After the hearing, I stepped outside into the sunlight. Reporters swarmed nearby, calling out his name. Cameras flashed, but none of it was about me. I walked away unnoticed, blending into the crowd. It felt right. I didn't need attention. I just needed peace. The investigator met me by the car and asked if I was okay. I nodded and said I was more than okay. I was done. For the first time in years, the world felt open again, full of possibilities instead of fear. That night, I went back to the old neighborhood one last time. The house was still there, lights on, occupied by the family who bought it. I stood across the street and smiled faintly. It no longer belonged to me, but somehow that didn't hurt anymore. I realized I didn't need it back to feel whole. The memories, good and bad, would always be mine. I whispered a quiet goodbye and turned to leave. The chapter was closed, and I finally felt ready to write a new one. As I walked away, I heard the distant chime of the old church bell from down the road. It rang steady, echoing softly through the air. That sound, once haunting, now felt like a promise of peace. I paused and looked up at the dark sky, the stars faint but clear. I thought about everything I'd survived, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a victim of his choices. I felt like the author of my own story, one that no one could rewrite again. When I got home that night, I sat in silence for a long time. The trial hearing had ended, but the echo of it stayed with me. His voice, once so familiar, now sounded empty and defensive. I replayed his testimony in my mind. Every denial, every excuse, it didn't matter anymore. The truth was stronger than any lie he could tell. I made tea, sat by the window, and let the steam warm my face. I felt something inside me shift, like the final weight had lifted from my shoulders. The next morning, my lawyer called to confirm that my ownership of the house was being reviewed. Because the sale had been based on forged documents, it could be reversed. I didn't know how to feel about it. The house had once been everything to me, but now it was just a place filled with memories, some sweet, most painful. Still, the idea of reclaiming it meant something symbolic. It wasn't about property. It was about restoring what had been stolen. I thanked him and agreed to handle whatever paperwork was needed. A few weeks later, the process was complete. The sale was declared invalid. I was once again the legal owner of the house. I had lost. The investigator congratulated me, saying it was rare for justice to come so full circle. I drove there alone that evening. The neighborhood looked just as I remembered, but quieter. When I parked outside, I didn't rush to go in. I just sat in the car staring at the front door, trying to decide whether to step back into that part of my life again. Eventually, I walked up to the porch. The key still fit the lock. Inside, the air smelled stale, faintly of dust and paint. The rooms were empty now. The new owners had moved out after the investigation. I walked through slowly, touching the walls, the banister, the window frames. Every corner carried a memory. I ended up in the backyard, standing near the dead rosebush. The soil was dry and uneven. I knelt down and brushed it with my hand. That was where everything had started, and where it all had ended. As I stood there, something caught my eye, a small glimmer in the dirt. I crouched and dug a little deeper until my fingers hit metal. It was a watch, old and tarnished. I wiped the dirt away and recognized it immediately. It was his father's watch. He used to wear it on special occasions. I turned it over in my palm. The clock hands were still, but when I pressed the side button, it ticked once. Only once. It felt like a heartbeat, faint but alive, and then it went still again. I took the watch inside and set it on the table. It looked out of place in the empty room, sitting there like a ghost of the past. I didn't know why it was buried or what it meant, but somehow it felt like closure. I sat down beside it and stared at the walls around me. They used to feel like safety. Now they felt like history, something I could finally step beyond. I realized I didn't need to keep this place anymore. I could let it go and still keep my peace. Over the next few days, I worked on cleaning the house, dusting, sweeping, opening windows that hadn't been touched in months. The sunlight filled the rooms, making them look warmer. As I worked, I felt like I was cleansing not just the space, but my own past. Every corner I cleared reminded me that I had survived something meant to destroy me. When I was done, I stood in the living room, tired but proud. It wasn't about restoring the home, it was about proving that I could rebuild myself. One morning, reporters gathered outside the gate. Word had spread about the case. They wanted a statement, a comment, a reaction. I stayed inside, watching from behind the curtain. The investigator called and said, I didn't owe anyone an explanation. He was right. I didn't. I turned off my phone and went about my day. I made breakfast, opened the curtains wide, and let the morning light in. I had spent too long living in his story. It was time to write my own, one that didn't need an audience. A week later, I received an envelope from the court. Inside was the final judgment. My husband had been found guilty of fraud and identity misuse. He was sentenced to several years in prison. I sat at the table reading the document, feeling a wave of mixed emotions. There was no joy in it, only peace. The punishment didn't undo what he did, but it ended the story. I folded the papers neatly and placed them in a drawer beside the honey jar, both symbols of what I had outgrown. I called the investigator to thank him one last time. He said he was just glad to see me move forward. Before hanging up, he reminded me that healing doesn't always happen when the case ends. It happens when the heart stops fighting itself. His words stayed with me long after the call. That night, I sat outside on the porch, listening to the crickets. The air felt calm, the kind of quiet that used to make me anxious but now felt comforting. I had finally learned to be still without fear. The following week, I received a letter from a women's shelter I had donated to anonymously. They invited me to visit and share my experience with others who had gone through similar pain. I wasn't sure I could do it, but something inside me said I should try. When I visited, I met women who carried stories just as heavy as mine. Listening to them made me realize that survival wasn't just about escape. It was about connection. I promised myself that if my story could help even one of them, I'd tell it. After that day, I started volunteering regularly. I helped women write statements, find lawyers, or just talk through their fears. It gave me purpose again. Every time I walked into that shelter, I felt stronger. I wasn't just rebuilding my life, I was using my pain to build something meaningful. Sometimes I'd look around and think of how ironic it was. The woman who once lost everything was now helping others stand back up. Life had a strange way of turning pain into quiet power. I finally understood that. One evening, after volunteering, I came home and noticed the watch ticking faintly on the shelf. It had come to life again. The ticking was soft but steady, and when I checked the time, it was exactly midnight. I smiled to myself. Maybe it was coincidence, or maybe not. Either way, I took it as a sign that some parts of the past can still move forward when you let them. I placed it gently beside a small vase of fresh roses, the new kind I had planted behind the house. The following morning, I went out to the garden. The new rose bushes were blooming, their colors bright and full of life. I knelt to touch the petals, their texture soft against my fingers. The garden had once been a place of secrets, but now it was something else, a place of growth. I realized that the soil didn't remember the pain, only the care that followed. I had spent so long associating this place with betrayal. Now it stood as proof that even damaged ground can bloom again. Later that week, the investigator stopped by for a final visit. He looked tired but content. We sat on the porch, sharing coffee and quiet conversation. He asked if I planned to sell the house, now that it was back in my name. I told him I might, but not yet. I wanted to leave it on my terms, not because I was forced to. He nodded, understanding completely. Before he left, he handed me a small envelope. Inside was a photo of me smiling at the courthouse. He said I'd earned that moment. When he left, I sat with that photo for a long time. It wasn't about pride, it was about survival. That image captured the exact moment I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I placed it on the wall near the window, beside a small plant. Every time I passed by, I glanced at it, not to remember the pain, but to honor how far I'd come. It was a reminder that even after everything was taken from me, I still found a way to stand. And that was enough. Days turned into weeks. Life began to feel normal again, though it was a different kind of normal. I started working part-time from home, writing articles about recovery and resilience. The words flowed easily because they came from truth. Sometimes readers sent messages saying my writing helped them find hope. That meant more to me than anything else. I didn't need to look back anymore. My story wasn't just about betrayal, it was about rebuilding. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined me. They just reminded me I had healed. One morning, I woke up early and made a list of small goals: travel, new hobbies, maybe even moving to another city someday. I wasn't running away this time. I was planning forward. The fear that once ruled me was gone, replaced by curiosity. I wanted to see what else life had to offer beyond heartbreak. I folded the list and placed it on my nightstand. It felt good to think about beginnings again, not endings. Healing wasn't about forgetting, it was about learning how to live without carrying the past everywhere. That afternoon, I cleaned out the last few boxes in the attic. Most of it was junk, but at the bottom of one box, I found a photograph of us on our wedding day. I studied it for a moment, searching for clues I'd missed back then. Maybe there were signs, maybe not. I smiled faintly and placed it in the trash. It didn't hurt anymore. The love in that photo wasn't real anymore, but it didn't need to be. Letting it go didn't erase my story, it simply freed it. I spent the evening in the kitchen, cooking for myself. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the air. I poured a glass of water, lit a candle, and sat down to eat. It was simple, quiet, and peaceful. I didn't need company or noise, just being present felt like enough. As I ate, I thought about how strange it was that I used to fear being alone. Now solitude felt like strength. I realized then that I had found the life he tried to take from me, one built entirely on peace. The next morning, I stood by the window, watching the sunlight spread across the yard. I thought about the road that led me here, the betrayal, the loss, the truth, and the justice. Each part had shaped me into someone stronger. I didn't hate him anymore. Hate was heavy, and I'd carried it long enough. I whispered quietly, hoping the wind would carry it away. I forgive you. It wasn't for him, it was for me. Forgiveness wasn't about approval, it was about finally setting myself free, and I was ready. Later that day, I went back to the backyard, where the rose bushes stood tall. I knelt down and placed the old watch at the base of one plant. It ticked once, as if acknowledging me. I smiled. I wasn't burying it this time. I was giving it back to the earth, leaving it where it belonged. The garden didn't hold secrets anymore. It held peace. I stood up, brushed the dirt from my hands, and walked back inside. The sun felt warm on my face. Everything felt lighter now. In the evening, I sat on the porch with a notebook and began writing a new story. Not about him, but about strength. I wrote about what it meant to survive betrayal and how to find calm after chaos. The words came easily, like they'd been waiting all this time. It wasn't just my story anymore. It was for anyone who had ever been broken and thought they couldn't rise again. I wrote until the sky turned dark and the stars began to appear above the roofline. I closed the notebook and leaned back in my chair. The night air felt cool, and the sound of distant wind chimes filled the silence. I thought about how strange life could be, how pain could become wisdom, and endings could become beginnings. I didn't need revenge, and I didn't need recognition. All I needed was peace, and I finally had it. Somewhere far away, a church bell rang once. I smiled softly and whispered to myself, I made it. The words felt small but carried everything I had been through. The next morning, I woke early to sunlight spilling through the window. The house felt warm and alive again. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the garden sway in the breeze. For the first time in a long while, I didn't think about the past. My life wasn't defined by what was taken, but by what I had rebuilt. I realized then that justice wasn't about punishment. It was about balance, about finding peace and truth. And as I took the first sip of tea, I felt exactly that. The following weeks passed quietly. Life found a steady rhythm again. I woke early, worked from home, and ended my evenings with a walk through the garden. The roses were growing beautifully now, soft colors against the green, Every day felt like a small victory, proof that peace doesn't arrive suddenly, it grows quietly, like those flowers. I stopped checking the news, stopped waiting for updates. His story no longer belonged to me, mine was finally separate. I didn't realize how freeing that was until I lived it. I was finally breathing easily. One morning, I received a letter from the correctional facility. My husband had written to me. For a moment, I considered throwing it away unopened. But curiosity won. The letter was short. He wrote that he was sorry, that he didn't know how to live with what he'd done. He asked if I could ever forgive him. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer without answering. Forgiveness didn't need to be spoken or given. I had already done it quietly, for myself. I didn't owe him words anymore. Later that day, I went to the market and bought a small plant with red petals. I placed it on the windowsill beside my desk. It wasn't much, but it felt symbolic, a fresh start. Every time I watered it, I thought about how even small acts of care could rebuild what seemed broken. Healing wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, like a breath after tears. I smiled at that thought and returned to my writing, realizing I was creating something entirely new from the ashes of what was lost. The investigator called one afternoon to check in. He said the final paperwork had been filed, and the case was officially closed. There would be no appeals, no unfinished business. It was done. I thanked him again, and he said something that stayed with me. He said some people spend their lives chasing revenge and never find peace, but I had managed to do both without hatred. I laughed softly, saying I just wanted to survive. He replied that sometimes survival itself is the greatest victory of all. He was right. That night, I took out the honey jar from the drawer. It was nearly empty, just a trace of gold at the bottom. I turned it in my hands and remembered how much meaning it once carried. Fake apologies, empty comfort. Then I walked to the trash bin and dropped it in. It was a small act, but it felt final. No more remnants of what used to be. My life wasn't built on his sweetness anymore. It was built on truth, even if it came from bitterness first. That, I realized, was real freedom. In the following days, I found myself laughing more often. I called old friends, reconnected with people I hadn't spoken to in years. Some were surprised to hear from me, others just happy. I didn't talk about the past. I didn't need to. It wasn't part of me anymore. One evening, I joined a small community book club. It felt nice to sit among strangers who didn't know my story. To them, I was just another person. That normalcy was the most healing feeling I could imagine. I blended right in. The more time passed, the more distant the pain felt. I didn't push it away. It simply faded on its own. One evening, I stood by the porch as the sun set, painting the sky with warm colors. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who believed love was about trust without proof, silence without questions. I felt a quiet respect for her, not pity. She had done her best with what she knew. But now, I was different. I had learned that love and blindness are never the same. Sometimes, memories still found their way in, moments of laughter, road trips, the small joys that once felt pure. I let them come and go without fighting them. They didn't hurt anymore. They were just pieces of a story that had ended. I realized that healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means it stops controlling you. When I went back inside that evening, I lit a candle and sat quietly, not to mourn, but to honor the journey that brought me here. Every scar, every tear, every truth had meaning. A few weeks later, I decided to sell the house after all. It felt like the right time. The new buyers were a kind couple expecting their first child. They loved the garden. When we signed the papers, the woman smiled and said she could feel good energy in the home. That made me smile. She didn't know what it had been through. But maybe that was the point. It wasn't a house of secrets anymore. It was ready for a new story, and I was ready to begin mine somewhere new. The day I handed over the keys, I walked through the empty rooms one last time. The echo of my footsteps sounded peaceful, not lonely. I touched the walls gently, whispering a silent thank you. This house had seen everything: love, lies, pain, justice, and healing. It had been my prison and my sanctuary. Now it was neither. It was just a home again. When I stepped outside and closed the door, I didn't look back. The closure I needed wasn't behind that door. It was already within me. I packed a small suitcase and drove out of the city. The road stretched endlessly ahead, lined with trees and open fields. I rolled down the window and let the wind hit my face. I didn't know exactly where I was going, and for the first time, that felt exciting instead of scary. Life didn't need a plan anymore. It just needed movement. Somewhere far in the distance, I saw the faint shimmer of the ocean, and I smiled. It felt like the perfect place to start over again. I rented a small cottage near the shore. It was simple: white walls, wooden floors, and the sound of waves drifting through the windows at night. Every morning I walked along the sand with bare feet, feeling the cool water touch my toes. The ocean became my new reminder of peace, always changing, yet always calm beneath the surface. I spent my days writing, helping others, and learning how to live without fear. Each sunrise felt like proof that I had made it through the storm and found the shore. Sometimes I'd take out my notebook and reread what I had written during the hardest days. It amazed me how different I sounded back then: angry, scared, lost. Now my words carried something else: clarity, gratitude, hope. I wasn't writing from pain anymore. I was writing from strength. I decided to turn my journal into a book, not to relive the past, but to help others see that even after betrayal, life can bloom again. I titled it The House That He Sold. Somehow the name felt perfectly right. Months passed, and my book found its way into the world. Readers wrote letters thanking me for giving them courage. One message stood out. It said, "Your story reminded me that we're not defined by what breaks us." I read that line again and again. It was exactly what I had once needed to hear. I pinned that letter to the wall above my desk as a reminder that even pain, when shared truthfully, can become light for someone else lost in darkness. That made every struggle worth it. One evening, as I sat by the window, I watched the sunset reflect off the water. The sky glowed orange and gold, and for a moment, it felt like time had paused. I thought about the woman I used to be in that hospital bed, the one who woke up to betrayal and loss. I wanted to tell her that she'd make it through, that peace would come, not as a gift, but as something earned. I closed my eyes, breathed deeply, and silently thanked her for never giving up. Life became beautifully ordinary after that. I planted herbs outside the cottage, cooked simple meals, and laughed often. The quiet no longer felt like emptiness. It felt like balance. Sometimes I still heard the ticking of that old watch in my mind: steady, patient, never rushed. It reminded me that healing doesn't come quickly. It comes when you stop trying to control it. I realized then that I didn't just survive him. I outgrew the version of myself that once needed his approval. That was the real victory. One night, I walked along the beach and looked at the stars reflecting on the water. The waves washed over my feet, cool and soft. I whispered quietly into the wind, not to anyone in particular, but to the universe itself. I said thank you for the pain, for the lessons, for the second chance. The wind carried the words away, and I felt lighter. Every step forward on that sand felt like writing a new chapter, not one of revenge or grief, but one of quiet, lasting peace. When I returned to the cottage, I noticed the watch I had brought with me sitting on the table. It had started ticking again, faintly, right at midnight. I smiled and picked it up. The ticking felt steady and alive. I set it beside my bed, not as a reminder of him, but as a symbol of time moving on, of life continuing no matter what it's been through. I turned off the light and lay down, listening to the rhythm. It didn't haunt me anymore. It comforted me. The next morning, I woke to the sound of seagulls outside. The sunlight filled the room with warmth. I made tea and watched the waves roll endlessly, calm and certain. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. Every scar had turned into a story, every loss into wisdom. I no longer felt anger or grief, only gratitude. The world was wide open again, waiting for me to live it. I smiled and whispered softly to myself, "This is home," and for the first time, it truly felt that way. Weeks later, I hosted a small writing workshop at the local library. People of all ages came, eager to share their stories. I listened to each one with care, recognizing pieces of myself in their pain. When it was my turn to speak, I told them that healing doesn't erase the past, it transforms it. I saw heads nod, eyes glisten. In that moment, I realized I had found my calling. My story had started with loss, but it would continue as light for others finding their way through the dark. After the workshop, a young woman approached me. She said she was going through something similar and didn't know if she'd ever recover. I smiled gently and told her she already had, because she was still standing. She hugged me tightly, tears in her eyes. That moment reminded me why I had survived, to show others that survival is possible. When she left, I sat alone for a while, feeling proud and peaceful. The pain that once crushed me had now become someone else's strength. That was everything. The cottage felt warm that evening, the kind of warmth that comes from quiet contentment. I made dinner, wrote for a while, and then stepped outside to watch the ocean one last time before bed. The sky was clear, the stars endless. I thought about how strange it was that something so vast could make me feel safe. Maybe because it reminded me that no matter how big the storm once was, it always passes. The waves keep moving, the stars keep shining, and life keeps beginning again. As I stood there, I felt a sense of completion, not just of this chapter, but of something deeper. I realized that I didn't need anything else to feel whole, not apology, not closure, not even understanding. Wholeness had always been waiting for me, underneath all the fear and pain. I just had to stop searching in the wrong places. The night air felt soft, the sound of the waves steady and sure. For the first time, I understood what peace truly sounded like. It was this quiet, calm, alive. I went back inside and placed the watch, now ticking gently, on the nightstand beside me. Its rhythm matched the sound of the sea outside. I closed my eyes and thought about everything I had learned. Justice wasn't about destroying someone else. It was about restoring yourself. I had done that. I smiled faintly, feeling a quiet joy. I didn't need to say goodbye to my old life anymore. It had already transformed into something better, something true. I fell asleep, knowing I had finally found where I belonged. When the clock struck midnight, the watch ticked once, clear and strong. Outside, the waves crashed softly under the moonlight. I dreamed of roses blooming by the shore, their colors bright and endless. In the dream, I wasn't running or fighting. I was just walking forward, free and certain. The world wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful, and it was mine. I had turned betrayal into peace, loss into wisdom, and silence into strength. The watch kept ticking, steady and alive, just like me.